Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today. We're excited you could all be here. We're going to give folks a few more minutes to keep joining. We'll probably get started in about 5 minutes or so. Thanks. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar. We're giving others just a few more minutes to continue joining, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here today. If you're just joining us, you still have a couple minutes to continue getting settled. Go grab your tea, coffee, lunch, pen and paper, settle in, and we're going to give folks a couple more minutes to keep joining, and then we'll get started. Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for taking the time to be here. We're going to go ahead and get started. So again, thank you. We appreciate you taking the time as we all, work to figure out new ways to continue to provide services and serve participants in these challenging new times. So today's webinar is going to cover all things HOPWA intake, initial, and annual certification using remote methods. So before we dive into the content, I just wanted to go over a couple housekeeping pieces. This webinar is being recorded. Just to note, it's being recorded and it'll be available along with any handouts up on the HUD Exchange as soon as we can get it there in a couple weeks, a maximum. If you have questions today, you all are on mute, so please use the question box to submit any questions. We will try to get to as many questions as we can. If we can't answer your question today, we'll be following up offline. There is a handout today, a PDF of the slides. We're getting some feedback that is difficult for folks to view, so if you're having a hard time viewing that, we're working on getting it fixed, but if you can't view it, we'll be sending it out, emailing it out after the presentation. Okay. So with that, we're going to go ahead and get going. But before we do, I want to just let you know who we have on today's call. So joining us from HUD's Office of HIV/AIDS Housing, we have Amy Palonis, Senior Program Specialist, Ben Ayers, and Rita Harcrow. Ben Ayers, Deputy Director, and Rita Harcrow, Director. So thank you so much to our OHA staff for being here with us today. And I'm going to pass it over to you guys to say hello. Okay, are you guys able to unmute? Apologize, you might be having some technical difficulties. Heather or Steve, are you guys able to unmute?
Hi, Morgan. Yes, I am unmuted.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well, Amy, Rita, or Ben, if you guys are able to get unmuted in a moment and want to jump in and say hello, please feel free to do that.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
We're unmuted now. This is Rita Harcrow.
I'm sorry about that.
No worries. Rita Harcrow here. I'm the director of the Office of HIV/AIDS Housing, and I just want to say welcome. Thanks to everyone for taking time to join us today.
Thank you, Rita. We so appreciate you guys being here again. So from the Cloudburst group, we have myself, Morgan Stevenson, and then my colleagues, Steve Ellis and Heather Rhoda. And they are gonna kick us off, get going with today's learning objectives, and then dive into some content. So Heather, I'll pass it to you.
Great, thank you very much. Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's presentation. We're very excited that so many people were able to join, and we hope that you learn a lot of useful and valuable information today as you continue working with your clients. Next slide, please. The learning objectives in today's webinar, you will gain a better understanding of how you can continue to deliver HOPWA assistance using remote methods. Next slide. In this webinar, we're going to talk about HOPWA eligibility requirements. Just as a refresher, I'm sure everybody is well aware of what those eligibility requirements are. We're also going to review the income and HIV status waiver flexibilities. We're going to talk about the HOPWA activities that can be conducted remotely, the different types of remote methods, as well as how to plan, manage, and implement using remote methods. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers. And at the end of the presentation, include some resources, reminders, and some more reminders, as well as how to ask for and request HOPWA technical assistance and submit a question to the HOPWA Ask a Question desk. So diving right in. What are the HOPWA eligibility requirements? We're sure you're all aware, but first, let's review the eligibility requirements. Except for the HOPWA activity called Housing Information Services, to be eligible for HOPWA assistance, at least one family member must be diagnosed with HIV/AIDS. This can include a minor. And total income of all family members must be at or below 80% of the area median income. And as you know, this income must be verified initially and then annually thereafter. Next slide. So are there waivers regarding obtaining HIV documentation and income documentation? Yes, there absolutely are. The first mega waiver released on April 1st, 2020 includes flexibilities related to obtaining documentation of both HIV/AIDS verification and income. Income may be verified via self-certification, and HIV/AIDS diagnosis may be verified via other credible information. This, of course, is if source or third-party documentation is not available. Note that if using this waiver flexibility, the source or third-party documentation must be obtained within 3 months at the end of any public health emergency. We'll get into a little bit more about the specifics of each of these as we move along in the presentation. Next slide. So when applying the HIV verification waiver, what does this mean? What does HUD guidance say? In practice, programs may still be able to obtain appropriate source documentation of HIV status for many of your clients, right? Through testing centers or medical facilities. So those options should still be pursued whenever possible. When source documentation is not obtainable or timely, grantees making use of this waiver option should have policies in place allowing for other credible information to be used to document HIV status in lieu of the source documentation. These policies, and make sure of this, these policies should include information about what other credible information means, the documentation requirements for program entry, the required timeline for collecting source documentation after COVID restrictions have been lifted, and the actions taken if HIV status cannot be documented via source documentation at the time. Remember in the previous slide, we talked about how if you are using this waiver flexibility, source or third-party documentation must be obtained within 3 months at the end of any public health emergency. Next slide. So what happens if source third-party verification of HIV status cannot be obtained within 3 months or at all, right? Let's just start off. HUD expects this to be rare, right? If there are cases where source documentation verifying HIV status can't be obtained within the required 3-month period, as would occur if a client is found not to be HIV positive, the client would cease to meet HOPWA program eligibility and should be terminated from HOPWA assistance and directed to other non-HIV specific program resources. In addition, I want to repeat, HUD does expect this to be rare, but be prepared to take actions if this does occur. It's important to make sure that you're documenting client files throughout this entire period, stating clearly that other credible information was used to verify HIV status per the waiver. With this documentation in place, note that grantees and project sponsors providing HOPWA assistance to clients who may ultimately be shown to be ineligible based on HIV status should not be subject to any payback requirements as applicable. Next slide. So what does other credible information mean, right? There are several ways a person could provide credible information on HIV status. Some examples include, during an intake or in conversation, with an applicant or a client, do they seem to know things about HIV medications, doctors in the area who treat HIV, viral suppression, their own status and HIV medical history. Also note that other credible information can be provided by a referral from another HIV-specific agency that may have already obtained documentation of someone's HIV status. In addition, there might be a case manager within your organization who's already worked with the client who knows them to be HIV positive. So there are a lot of flexibilities and a lot of different options you have to choose from to verify HIV status. Next slide. So now that we've talked about HIV status, what about documenting income? Self-certification of income may be used in lieu of source documentation. We all know that HIV verification is only documented once, right? Upon determining eligibility for HOPWA assistance. But income eligibility determinations happen more frequently, right? At least annually and upon initial determination of assistance, and sometimes during an interim recertification, if someone has a change in their household size or a change in their household income. Most income changes may not necessarily affect income eligibility, but it is possible for those receiving TBRA or facility-based housing that income changes could affect their share of rent. Remember that self-certification can also apply to these recertifications. And use of self-certification requires notifying HUD that you're going to be using this waiver. Another thing to keep in mind is that in most cases, programs should continue to collect appropriate source documentation whenever possible. But if it's not available, you can certainly use self-certification of income. How does this play into self-certification of income regarding continuing to process annual and interim recertifications? Both of those activities do need to continue occurring, right? Those are normal program functions for rental assistance, and especially during this time period, more important for clients that may be negatively impacted by losses or income fluctuations. So programs should ensure that those income losses are reflected and taken into account, and interim recertifications continue to be processed so that program participants' share of rent can be adjusted. Next slide. So as you can see, the previously mentioned waivers support your overall ability, right, as providers to work with clients remotely, right? So do you have a flexibility to work with clients remotely? Yes, you do, and a waiver is not required for that. Grantees and project sponsors are highly encouraged to conduct processes like income verification, rent calculations, lease review, case management, and other activities using remote methods whenever it's warranted, given local public health directives. Remote activities can be conducted by phone calls, video conferencing, exchanging information through emails. But make sure when you're implementing these remote methods, and we'll talk about this a little bit further into the presentation, programs should carefully document all of those interactions and make sure that confidentiality protections are in place. Next slide. Another item supporting working with clients remotely is that obtaining hard signatures from applicants or HOPWA assisted households is not required, right? It's normally a locally imposed requirement. So it's not a HUD requirement per se. So grantees should look at all reasonable methods that will allow program activities to continue, including temporarily bypassing any locally imposed hard signature requirements. You can use remote methods to do so. Documents can be signed and scanned and emailed back to programs. You can use electronic signatures, or if the above are not possible, you can also work with your clients and obtain verbal agreements from them to sign. Make sure that all of this information is documented by program staff and maintained in client files. Hopefully none of this is surprising to anybody. These are great resources and flexibilities that are allowable, and a wonderful opportunity to continue working with your clients to make sure they're able to maintain stable housing and continuing to access assistant and much needed services. So next slide, sorry, Morgan. So what are the types of remote methods? We already touched on this a little bit, but to repeat, you can use video conferencing, you can use phone calls, text, exchange of information via email or mail. And don't forget about confidentiality. We will get into this a bit more later on in the presentation. So moving right along to the next slide, what does it really mean or look like to conduct an intake, initial, or annual recertification remotely? I like to think about it this way. We've all contacted clients by phone, right? Some prefer email, and of course, we've all used mail and faxing. If they do, I don't know if people still fax, but I suppose there are still fax machines. Often, though, we would use those remote methods to initiate contact with clients, right? To coordinate in-person appointments, because we might need to complete an intake, or we might need to do an initial or annual recertification, rather than completing those entire processes remotely. So part of our function as case managers and HOPWA program staff has always included some kind of remote method. So some of this isn't new, right? So working with clients remotely is especially important during this time, because programs are still required to determine HOPWA program eligibility. So when you're going to work with a client remotely, and you might be doing an initial intake, or meeting a client for a first time, or beginning processes of determining if somebody's eligible for rental assistance, what does that look like? In the next couple of slides, Steve's going to take over, and we're going to show you, using video conferencing as an example, a couple of video clips where Steve, who's acting as a HOPWA TBRA coordinator for a local organization called Port Landing, and Heather, myself, acting as an applicant, and my name is Samantha, recently called Port Landing and left a message inquiring about rental assistance options. Steve then contacted Samantha to schedule a video conference call and also provided her with preliminary information about what will be discussed during the call, including ways in which HIV status and household income can be documented. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Heather. So as we did on a previous webinar, we do have a few clips that we're going to show. The entire intake that we conducted via live streaming will also be available. So just as a quick introduction to this first slide, as Heather mentioned, we talked a little bit about her phone call. We did a little bit of prep work. We did some confidentiality work, which we'll discuss on a future slide. But so when we start this clip, we were already sure that we're talking to the right people, we're talking about the right program, right? That the client is reporting having HIV. So all of that's out of the way before we get to this clip. Morgan, do you want to try to play the first example, please?
Yes, let me get that loaded up.
Grab your popcorn.
Exactly.
All right, so it's just you and your two children, ages 11 and 8.
Correct.
Great. So there are two basic eligibility criteria for our program, Samantha.
Okay.
One of which is HIV.
Mm-hmm.
So as you know from one of the many programs we offer it, from some of the information you submitted, I do need to prove that you or one of your two daughters has a HIV diagnosis.
Okay. And that would be me. They do not.
Right.
And do you need like certain types of verification, or will we get into that?
Yeah, we can get into that right now.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the things to prove that is I just need to have something in a file to be able to prove they have HIV. Whatever I have in the file needs to be fairly obvious that you have been diagnosed with HIV, so that anyone who comes in can read that file and understand that you are eligible.
Okay.
So what I want to go through is a few options that maybe we can prove your eligibility now. And if not, then we can talk about some next steps to go ahead and move forward while we track down.
Okay. Sure.
So while I have you on the call, some of the options could be, I don't know if you have access to any electronic records, but potentially we can screen share and I could take a screenshot and print that out. If that's an option that you take, I'll make sure to delete the screen share because once I have it in my file, I no longer need the electronic version. We can also do a screenshot if you have any paper around. Maybe you have your diagnosis or HIV labs or something that you can show. Other than that, we can do a verbal release of information. I can contact your infectious disease doctor. You can send something through the mail. Whatever you're most comfortable with, it is your information. So I want to make sure you choose something that you're okay with.
Okay. All right. Well, I have some papers here. I was just collecting a bunch of information. Oh, right here. I have lab results. Is that something that would work? I'm not sure I could mail it, or do you want to?
Yeah, if you could show me now if you're comfortable, because at least then that way we can prove eligibility and we can send a copy so I have something.
And I could just follow up with a hard copy. Okay.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can.
If you could you just hold it, put it a little further down. Excellent. I see your name. Perfect. If you could go back, hold it up a little higher again. And perfect. It shows a viral load of below 20, which works for verification. You're all good, Samantha.
Great.
So that will work. Congratulations on being undetectable.
Oh, thank you.
So at least for the rest of this conversation, I can assume eligibility. It would be great to get a copy of that. So if you either want to mail a copy in my follow-up email, the office is open a few hours each week. So you can call and schedule a quick appointment, come in, and someone can photocopy that if you'd rather hand it off to someone.
Okay, yeah, because of, yeah, okay.
But that way, once we get that in the file, then we are set for all of your time with our agency for any
Okay.
activity that you were to apply for. So.
Okay.
From our first video example, we offered the client, Samantha, different methods that she could choose the most comfortable way for her to try to prove her HIV status when she revealed it was her and not anyone else in her family that had HIV. So going through the options that we were aware of, that we were comfortable with doing, she was able to pick the one, so she had the labs available that she could show up to the screen. So that way, as I was determining her eligibility for the HOPWA program, I immediately had my eyes on HIV verification. So to the side, I was making a little note. I was going to put that note in the file, verifying what I saw when I saw it. And then as well as you saw in the clip, the follow-up information about when I could get that source documentation in the file, particularly because I knew she had it. So it was this great way to make sure that using remote methods, I could figure out if Samantha was eligible for HOPWA, do documentation in that moment so there wasn't a delay, but continue to follow up to get source documentation for the file. Heather, did you have anything you wanted to add about our first example?
What I did like was that in prepping for the video, we actually did, like internally, right, as Steve and I were role playing, we actually did have a conversation between ourselves about what we needed to talk about first before we even had the video conference, as if he was really program staff and I, and I was an applicant seeking assistance. So I think that's really important. So a lot of these items aren't presented cold, right, to someone that you're just starting to talk to.
Great. So before we show our next clip, as we mentioned, these were clips of a larger intake. So we want to let you know, as you heard a little bit on that first clip, we are already aware of Samantha's family size and composition. So in between, after this HIV clip and before the next one, we really started to figure out the other half of HOPWA eligibility, her income. So we talked about what income sources she or anyone in her family might have, if she expects any changes to her household or her income in the next 12 months. So during this conversation, Samantha confirmed that she's not expecting any changes, right? She's not expecting anyone to move in or to move out. She once again confirmed that she has 2 children. Those children are ages 11 and 8. And through our conversation, we determined that Samantha works, so she has employment income. She has one of her children receives a Social Security survivor's benefit, which we do need to include as part of income eligibility. We asked about assets. Samantha reports she has a checking and savings account, and that both of her children also have a savings accounts. So with that in mind, let's watch the second example. So let's go through source by source. So for your employment income, do you happen to have access to pay stubs?
I do. I do. I have a couple right here.
Oh, wonderful.
Yep.
How often do you get paid, Samantha?
Every other week.
All right.
Yeah, every other week.
Do you get paid twice a month or every other week? So where 2 times a year you actually get 3 paychecks in a month?
Yes, that one. Every other
Great.
week.
So you get paid bi-weekly.
Bi-weekly, yeah.
All right. Just wanted to make sure. Do you know how much you earn per hour?
Yes, I wish I earned more, but $12.50 right now.
$12.50. You said you're currently working 24 hours?
Yes, both paycheck stubs are showing, yeah, the past couple of weeks, most recent periods, I work 24 hours.
Excellent. Do you have any expectation of your hours or wage changing in the near future?
Not right now, no.
All right.
No, no. I haven't heard anything from my employer about that. And actually, some people have been laid off. So I'm lucky that they just reduced my hours. So maybe I'll be able to pick up some hours here or there, but I haven't heard anything definite about that.
All right. If that does change, please make sure to notify the program
Okay.
when that happens, at least for the time being. I think when you drop off your HIV verification or however you want to send that in, because once I send you an email, you can also, if you have access to those via email, you can send them.
Oh, okay.
If you could send that once again, just so I have something in the file documenting everything that you've just told me for your employment income.
Okay.
As for your daughter's Social Security,
Yep.
do you have any documentation of that?
Yes. Right here.
Great.
Like you can see that when I say right here. Yes.
The document that you have, can you tell me how much does she make or receive?
$5.25 per month.
I'm going to rephrase that because I don't want to say Social Security make.
Right.
The document that you have in your hand, can you tell me how much your daughter receives?
Yes, $5.25 per month.
$5.25. Is that what she's supposed to receive, or is that what she actually receives
Oh,
and
wait,
some
I'm
money's
sorry.
coming out?
No, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. She was getting $5.25 and then it changed in April to $5.50. Okay, that's right.
So as of April 2020, correct?
Yes,
All right.
yes, absolutely right. Yep.
Can you, if you're comfortable with that also, can you hold up that Social Security letter? I would have asked you for the pay stubs, but those tend to be way more complex for
Right.
us to review. And so
Yeah.
what you've told me is enough, but the Social Security would be great. Great. So I see your name. I see your daughter's name. I see the dates. I see them out. Oh, and I see where it changed.
Yeah.
Excellent. All
Usually
right.
it's to see initially, you think you know, but then I remembered, yeah,
Yeah.
5.25, 5.50.
So the same for the HIV documentation. Even though I've seen it, if you can make sure we get a paper copy of that, that would be much appreciated.
Okay.
And so finally, you reported having some checking and savings accounts.
Yes.
Do you know roughly what the balance is in your checking account any given time?
Maybe right around 1,050.
Right. And you said you don't think it has an interest.
I'm sure it doesn't.
All right.
Checking account.
As for savings, did I understand that you and each one of your daughters has a savings account, or?
Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So there's
Yep.
3. Do you know how much is in each account at any sort of given time?
My account might roughly have about 1,000 in it also, and each of the girls have 400 in each of their accounts.
And you said you don't know the interest rate, but
I don't know.
it's
It's probably like 1%
all right.
or less, right around there.
Great. All right. And once again, those are the only income sources that you have, correct?
Yes. Yes.
Great. So as you can see from our second example, we reviewed Samantha's different income types for her household members. We showed you a couple of different methods during that clip, including having Samantha self-certify her earned income, as well as showing physical documentation for her daughter's Social Security income. Once Samantha self-verified her income, we walked her through what would have been on that pay stub, including how often or the frequency of her pay, the number of hours, the rate, all of those pieces of information that we would need to calculate her annual income. We didn't need that for the Social Security income because we were able to look at recent documentation and know what her income was. But you'll note one thing that happened during that conversation is when we asked for gross income, Samantha did catch herself and notice that she initially said the wrong amount. So it's worth walking clients through any documentation that they might have to make sure they are sharing the accurate information there. Finally, since asset information can be pretty difficult to assess via any remote method, we did have Samantha self-certify those pieces of information. As we had mentioned earlier, we did not in that moment calculate her household income or determine HOPWA eligibility. By just collecting that information, we're able to pause and take some time to make sure we're calculating everything correctly. And finally, at the end of that clip, you'll notice that we continued to mention the need for her to drop off physical documentation or to send us physical documentation for the file. So all of that was there in case a grantee or HUD came to monitor us. Heather, is there anything you want to add about our second example?
I think that was a really good point that you made, Steve, about Social Security, survivor benefits, or Social Security income in general. Sometimes the notifications can be lengthy and have multiple pages. So it is good to, if you can, see a version, or as you're talking to a client, to walk them through a little bit and mention what amount they might be looking for, and reiterate that it is the gross amount that you need. Unless, of course, you'll be using the net amount in some situations, but in most cases, you're going to be using the gross amount.
Well, great. With our two examples out of the way, let's talk about how you manage different virtual certification methods. But first, before we go into different types of virtual or remote methods, let's talk about confidentiality. So before discussing any confidential information over any remote method, including program eligibility, program staff should review some pieces of information with the client. So some of this would be topics such as confirming that the live stream room that we are using are locked. So in our particular example, before we went through the two clips, using the method that we did, I did confirm with Samantha that the room was locked so that no one else could join. I let her know this, not only for her own sense of safety or confidentiality, but also for this call or any future call that I might have with Samantha. If there was someone else that needed to join, she would need to notify me so I could keep an eye on it. You should also cover the identity of the client or household. So clearly, before discussing the ins and outs of your program and any eligibility, make sure that you are talking with the right person. Right? So in our particular example, Samantha reached out to our agency, and so in the full intake clip that will be available, we started part of our conversation with her confirming her name and date of birth so I could make sure I was talking with the right person. We also confirmed the topics that would be discussed, especially the sensitive information, so that Samantha wouldn't be surprised when certain topics, particularly around HIV, came up on part of our call. So she also wouldn't be surprised. We confirmed if anyone else from the agency or anyone else from her household might be joining the call or might be in the background, That way, no one was surprised if anyone showed up on screen. And finally, we also discuss any goals or limitations of the call. So as we keep mentioning, right, we told Samantha that we would not be determining HOPWA eligibility right at that moment. However, we'd be collecting some information to assess her eligibility. And at the end of our intake, we did schedule a second follow-up call that was going to be held the next day, where I could share her eligibility and then immediately go into her eligibility for HOPWA TBRA. So we took that moment to make sure Samantha knew during this intake that she wouldn't have all of the answers she needed, because we would need some time, but we did let her know that she would get all the information she needed pretty quickly to make sure that she and her family stay housed. Any special confidentiality considerations you'd like to add, Heather?
No, I think those were covered well.
So when we go through different methods of remote methods, we're going to break these up to different types. So the first we're going to discuss is video conferencing. So it's obvious that video conferencing is pretty personally interactive throughout the entire method, right? Because you're able to have a face-to-face conversation. It's almost like you're meeting with the applicant or assisted household in person. So through this method, you can provide the applicant or household with the information that they need and ask them information that you'll need for an intake, an initial, an annual, right, whatever that might be. And then as well as be able to, in that moment, explain any follow-up that might be needed, whether that's by mail or email, confirm those follow-up methods with the client, and then circle back at the end of the conversation. So as we mentioned before, make sure during any remote method, particularly video conferencing, that you might need additional information as follow-up, particularly around income assets and income deductions. We would recommend, when you use video conferencing, to practice. So practice with a fellow staff member, practice with another person in the agency. That way you're used to all the confidentiality conversations. You're used to all the security features. You're used to what a screenshot might look like if that's what you choose to do. You are comfortable with all of the ins and outs before you practice or actually go through a conversation with the client. You also want to make sure to set the pace for your video conference. You don't want to go too fast if the client feels uncomfortable or you're missing information, but you also don't want to go too slow and that the conversation drags out. It'd be key, particularly when using video conferencing, to make sure this is something that the household is able to do, right? So while many people have technology such as a tablet or a smartphone that they might be able to use video conferencing, not everyone does. And so you should inquire that if video conferencing is even feasible for your conversations. This would be important, especially important for intakes or initial conversations, right? Because you want to use video conferencing for clients that you may not know or may not be fully aware of yet, right? So so if you haven't met a client, you're going through the intake, video conferencing would be important, but that may not be possible. Make sure if you are going to use video conferencing that all devices are fully charged, right? Any conversation could take a period of time and you don't want your battery to die on you midway through any conversations. And finally, as always, be mindful of confidentiality. So on top of the points we just covered, it's worth remembering, right, that this is live. And so you're going to be discussing protected information and voices can travel. So someone's going to be on their computer microphone and speakers or their cell phone microphone and speakers, and so others could hear. Right? So be mindful of what you say and how loud you are. Be mindful of your background, particularly at the agency level, to make sure there's nothing identifying for your organizations that could tip anyone off that you are an HIV or HOPWA funded agency. Once again, find out who, if anyone else, may be present in the conversation or may join later. That way you could be mindful of where conversations might need to shift or change. And finally, as part of any confidentiality policy an agency should have, but particularly when using video conferencing, make sure to refer to your program as a pseudonym if your actual agency name does identify you as an HIV or HOPWA funded agency. So if anyone does overhear, you don't reveal information about the client. Anything you'd like to add, Heather?
Just an additional comment under referring to a program under a pseudonym. This even extends to, and I think in one of the videos or elsewhere in the presentation, we talk about making sure information that you're mailing, right? Mailing to potential applicants or current program participants as you're working on doing more initial and annual recertifications or intakes remotely, make sure your envelopes and any letterhead is also titled with that pseudonym and doesn't call out that you're a HOPWA provider or an organization that serves only people who are HIV positive or have an AIDS diagnosis.
Great. And as a reminder, video conferencing can be a really great remote tool to have conversations, but be mindful of those conversations, right? That, this might be something that you really want to require to the best of your ability for new applicants or new households so that you can try to meet someone face to face. You might try to require video conferencing for more sensitive conversations, say when you go through a rental calculation. That way you can read someone's face if they understand what you're explaining, or for sensitive conversations with case management, right? So just be mindful of video conferencing, and it could be the best tool for particular conversations. When video conferencing isn't available, or in conjunction with video conferencing, there's always the telephone or texting. So phone conversations can also be interactive as you're able to ask and answer questions, but texting definitely isn't as interactive or personal as any of the other methods. So phone or text will likely require additional follow-up, especially to get the physical documentation that you're going to need for your file. So a telephone conversation or texting would probably not be suitable for new households or to have sensitive or important conversations. If you do use the telephone or text to communicate with the client, you'll want to consider, as always, who else might be present. That way you can ask if continuing the call is okay, right? So we've all had telephone calls with clients that you hear, a different voice in the background, right? So it's the same idea. It's just checking with that client. Is anyone else home? Could anyone else come home? And do we need to stop the conversation if that happens? As part of any follow-up, make sure to discuss safe and confidential ways to send documents, especially if they're going to send it via texting, right? So make sure that if someone's going to take a picture of documents and send it to you, that it's going to come directly to you, that they know they can send it to you directly, that you can confirm that you received it, and also what you're going to do with any documentation once you receive it, right? Are you going to save it in an electronic file? Are you going to print it and delete it from your cell phone? These are all things that you should be mindful of and explain to the client as part of any remote method. Finally, as part of any remote method or in conjunction with these two, there's obviously email or mail. So this is also not interactive, but it's very useful to obtain documents and or signatures. So as we mentioned earlier, hard signatures are not a requirement for the HOPWA program, but they can be very useful in making sure that clients have seen certain paperwork, seen certain policies, and understand those policies. So if you are going to use mail to get any documentation or send any documentation out, particularly if you're going to need something back, we would recommend sending a self-addressed stamped return envelope with any paperwork. That way you have a much better chance of getting everything back, so postage isn't a barrier for the client. If you're going to use these methods, remember, as always, to discuss safe and confidential ways to send these source documents, especially via email. If you're able to walk a client through on how to save an electronic document, and particularly to password protect it, that way, if it gets emailed, there's less chance of anyone being able to open it if it goes to the wrong recipient. Make sure your email address is secure and confidential. Make sure the email address comes directly to you and not anyone else in your agency. As Heather had mentioned about mail, but the same can work for email, make sure that you're referring to everything about your agency as a pseudonym so that if anyone receives the mail at the client household besides the client, you don't reveal any information that shouldn't be revealed. Same for any emails, right? So if they go to the wrong person or received by the wrong person, someone's confidential information is still protected. And finally, something to really be mindful of, as I don't think we think of it a lot, but always, if you're going to use email, check in with the household, with the client, to see if anyone else is going to be using that same email address. Right, so there are people and households out there that have a common email address, or everyone has access to an email address. So you definitely don't want to send confidential information that might reveal health information through an email address that others could see. Heather, is there anything you'd like to add about telephone, text, email, or mail?
No, I think you touched on all the key elements.
Great. As we begin to end our slides for today, let's talk quickly about how do you plan for and implement any and all remote methods. As always, for remote methods or for any of the waiver flexibilities offered by HUD or HOPWA, make sure to notify HUD of your use. If you look at some of the additional information at the end of this PowerPoint, you'll see there's information on who to contact to notify individuals of your intent to use any of these waivers. As always, if you are going to implement any remote methods, make sure to review and update your current policies and procedures to talk about the use of these remote methods, whether you're going to use them for case management, for intake, for initials, for interims, for annuals. All of that should be part of your policies and procedures. Now, this does not mean that you need to totally rewrite your entire policies and procedures manual to include remote methods. You can just develop and write an addendum to your current manual to discuss any changes that are occurring due to COVID-19, due to the CARES Act, due to any local health emergencies. We are currently working on and will soon release a guide to assist you in updating your policies and procedures for remote methods. So make sure to look at that when available to assist you with those. When using remote methods, make sure to train all relevant HOPWA program staff. So any of your housing workers, any staff that might be working with other housing activities such as STERMU, your case managers, everyone should be aware on how to use these, particularly to protect confidentiality and to be comfortable so that the client feels comfortable. Make sure to assess the current type of technology you have on hand and see if any upgrades are needed, whether in hardware or software. These costs are eligible under the HOPWA program, the cost of upgrading or purchasing any technology. So if those are things that you need to carry this out, make sure to look into that and to document accordingly. And finally, we can't stress this enough. If you are going to use remote methods and you are changing your policies and procedures, please make sure to communicate that with the community. So talk about these changes and the use of remote methods with landlords, with assisted households and community partners. So that way everyone's aware that the hard work and the necessary work that you do for the HOPWA program is going to continue even through any local health emergencies. With that, let's see if there's any questions.
Yes, there were some that I have answered. So I'm just going to mention a couple of those in case everybody hasn't seen them. One question was about with new medications, people become non-progressors. Do they still need annual HIV proof? And the response to that is that HUD does not require annual verification of HIV status. Someone's HIV status, unlike, you know, some income, household income, the HIV positive status is not going to change. If they're HIV positive, they're going to be HIV positive. So there is no annual requirement. It could be that that might be a locally imposed requirement, but it's not a HUD requirement. There is a question about, okay. Remember in the slide we talked about verification, like obtaining HIV status verification, right? And how you can use other credible evidence. And then, you know, you have to obtain follow-up documentation within 3 months after the, you know, pandemic or public health directive restrictions are lifted. And there was a mention that as long as, and I'm paraphrasing, as long as grantees and project sponsors are doing their due diligence, right, and documenting everything in the client file, and they accepted credible evidence in good faith, that if clients are later found ineligible, the clients should not have to pay back. The question is, would the program have to pay back, the grantee or project sponsor? And Rita from OHH is going to take that question.
Right.
Go ahead,
so yeah, so like you said, the client would not have to pay back. And there's different ways that scenario could happen. I can imagine having worked with clients. I mean, it could be, you know, they thought they had documentation and didn't, or maybe never had it. So there's different scenarios there. But if you as the program are acting in good faith, you have documentation on, you know, what you did know from them, what caused you to think that they were likely eligible, and also that you have given notice that you're applying that waiver.
Right.
So that's an important piece, that you're applying the waiver that exempts you from requiring that that kind of documentation. Then you've acted in good faith and would not be liable for those costs.
Great. There was, do we want to talk about the Ryan White card question a little bit more, or ask some information about it? For example, remember we were talking about different forms of other credible information, other credible evidence to verify HIV status, and someone asked if a Ryan White card could be used to verify that. And I'm going to say, I don't know what a Ryan White card looks like. So I can't answer that. So I'm going to defer to HUD on that one. Or if we need to parking lot that one too for, you know, additional research, we can do that also, because there are some times questions might be a little nuanced, and we kind of parking lot them, and then we take all the unanswered questions and draft them and come up with responses, and then send them out to all the attendees, you know, within a couple of weeks after the webinar.
Well, right. This is Rita again. I mean, I'll try to answer, but without a little more information, I think it's challenging. So, you know, we don't know exactly what is a Ryan White card, what your organization's relationship is with the Ryan White program. Is it something you would scan, be able to see information? Does it have a name on it, or something that would, you know, provide enough information? I think it would depend on the situation. Typically, though, if someone can verify that they're receiving services from a Ryan White provider, then that is enough, because that means that their status has already been verified. So, in general, that's a yes, but as far as what a Ryan White card would indicate, that might be something that you could consider. If it's hard to tell if it's linked to the person requesting and receiving services from HOPWA, then it might be adequate for the waiver type of documentation until you can get something more appropriate. But again, I think there's just some nuances there that are not quite clear.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, and there seems to be a few questions around HIV documentation, and
Yes.
I think it's that similar idea around what you might accept to do an initial assessment, right? That initial waiver might be different than what you follow up with and have in the file. So that anything you have in the file is very apparent to someone who maybe isn't medically trained, to someone who isn't aware of potential benefits, that they can look at a piece of paper, look at a piece of documentation and know that someone is in fact diagnosed with HIV, right? Regardless of maybe their viral load or anything like that, right? So just keep in mind that that follow-up documentation, whatever that is in the file, needs to be clear to that untrained eye.
And Steve, I'll just follow up with that to say that as a reminder, what we're trying to do with the waiver and in consideration of the pandemic, that we're all, struggling and doing the best we can, and that's the expectation for you right now as well. So, use your best judgment, try to get as much information as you can, and deliver services where it's possible, given the circumstances we're all in. At some point, we will return to that other expectation, and we can talk more about that when that time comes. So thanks.
Question, if somebody wants to take this, what if a client exited from the program and returned at a later date? Do we still need HIV verification?
This is Ben. I mean, if you can identify that it's the same exact person, then you already have HIV verification for that person. You could just
Right.
put a copy of it in the file.
Excellent. So I think too that some of these questions, right, could be related to local requirements about obtaining any kind of documentation, but in this instance it's specifically HIV. So there's definitely a difference and a flexibility that the waivers are allowing you to do. But even beyond that, generally, HIV verification, going back to the annual, like doing an annual recertification, and HUD, if you want to chime in too, obtaining HIV verification on an annual basis is not a HUD requirement. I'll take that. Yes, agreed. Here's a question. Should agencies have a confidentiality agreement that clients can virtually sign and keep in the file, or is only verbal okay? Somebody would like to take that?
So hi, this is Rita. I'll give it a shot. So again, I think the more validated form that you can get, the better. So if you have a standard confidentiality form that you have in place and you have a methodology to get that signed, that is better. If you do not have access to that and can get a verbalized agreement and document that, that would be a second best option.
Okay, I'm looking for other questions. Let me see.
Here's a question. So someone asked, if you determine eligibility visually, are you able to move on with the process for assistance? And then coupled with that, what if you verify virtually, but the client fails to submit that follow-up documentation? So, right, so as we had talked about, it's going to depend on what you have done as part of that eligibility process, right? So if you've seen the documentation through some sort of remote method, right, then you can definitely move on to providing assistance because you've seen it, you know it exists. So, I mean, you can feel more comfortable with moving on. As we had mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean right away in the moment, you need to go ahead and calculate annual income, right? We would recommend potentially just taking that breather. That way you can make sure that you've collected all the information you need to adequately determine if the household is eligible for HOPWA. And then we had talked about, right, if someone doesn't submit that proof and you haven't seen it, right, then at a certain point that household is no longer considered eligible for HOPWA until you do get the HIV documentation in the file.
Great, thank you. There was a question regarding income, one of my absolute favorite topics, annual income and calculating rent. And I'm just going to briefly review it. It said, please review the information about Social Security income for children. So if a household has in it a family member who is a minor, and that minor, 17 years of age or under, is receiving, Social Security survivor benefits or Social Security income for disability, that Social Security income must be included in the total household, the total family annual income. There's some good information about income inclusions and exclusions in the HOPWA Rental Assistance Guidebook, which is available on the HUD Exchange.
And is there, sorry, this is Ben. I think there might be a HOPWA Institute
Yes.
question up online about calculating income.
Right.
As well. And just wanted to give a call out to you as well, Heather, and the the TA team that they're currently working on a rent curriculum that will hopefully be out there at least by I want to say beginning middle of next year. So you should have some additional tools on this coming your way.
Right. And that's a good point, Ben. Sorry, I forgot about that. But if you also go to the HUD Exchange and you look up information about the 2017 HOPWA Institute, there is a video training, and it's called Rent Calculation, in 25 minutes, which provides, a high-level overview about determining annual income, calculating income, and what income is and isn't included. So that's another resource. I think too, now we're going to pause on the questions. So we apologize if we didn't get to everybody's question, but we will make sure that we do, gather them all together and draft responses, and then make sure all the attendees are provided with that information. I don't know, Steve, Morgan, if you want to review the resources, reminders, and more reminders and more reminders at the end of this presentation.
So, so if you need more information, right, we always recommend that people stay informed. So one of the great ways to stay informed and up to date is the HUD Exchange. All things HOPWA and COVID-19 and these flexibilities will end up on the HUD Exchange, particularly if you're on the mailing list. So, a great example is, this recording, the transcript, the videos, and even the webinar we did last time about virtual inspections, which came up as a few questions, right? All of that will end up on the HUD Exchange for you to watch and to review. So make sure that you are signed up for the HUD Exchange mailing list. So you'll see the links there, as we mentioned, because you weren't able to download this presentation from today, we will email it out as soon as we're finished. So you will have all of these live links available to you.
Next slide.
Trying.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah. Sorry, I said, because we're talking about remote methods, it's taking a jolly time. Any other topic, it would not have this issue. So these are the resources that you've all seen and know, but we want to remind people of them. So these links are on HOPWA guidance, both waivers. You'll have the hyperlinks to the CPD director contact information. So if you do plan on utilizing these waivers, as a reminder, grantees are the ones who should be notifying HUD of use of the waivers. If you're a project sponsor listening, please talk to your grantee about this or any questions that might come up. You'll also see some information and resources around other topics that we've talked about, particularly the HOPWA notice and IDIS setup. Also, for those of you who aren't aware of one of the greatest HOPWA resources out there, the Ask a Question desk, right? So if you have questions about the HOPWA program, the notice, anything with implementing COVID-19, the CARES Act funding, anything we've discussed, please submit a HOPWA AAQ through the portal. We love seeing those questions and following up with people. And finally, HOPWA grantees, if you do need additional assistance in implementing any of these waivers or implementing any of your CARES Act funds, there's technical assistance available. The link is there for those grantees who wish to seek such assistance. A final reminder, the coming attractions, right? So next Wednesday, September 2nd from 2 to 3, we'll have another HOPWA CARES Act and COVID webinar on supportive services. So please look for the HUD Exchange email to sign up and for more information on that. With that, Morgan, do you want to close us out?
And I'd just like to make one more comment. And as always, as you can see from this experience alone, right, if you're going to be using certain types of video technology, right, with your clients and working with them remotely, even though we did do this, I promise you, we practiced and practiced and practiced, everything was working great. Make sure you give yourself some time to set up and practice, and then you have the right platforms and the the computer bandwidth, able to do that, because obviously things happen and technology can be a little quirky sometimes. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Heather. Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone again for taking this time today. We hope it was helpful to you, and we do apologize again about the technical difficulties for those of you had a hard time seeing videos, and then for the discrepancies with the video showing on the second video. But again, as Steve said, these slides will be emailed right after after we close up here. So if you're registered, you'll get a copy of this. And everything will be posted on the HUD Exchange, this webinar as well as the other ones we've done before, along with the, any videos that were a part of it and the handouts. And if we didn't get to your question, thank you so much for submitting them today, and don't panic. We will follow up with those offline as well. So thank you again so much for your time. Good luck and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Be well.